Radcliffe and the Sublime. You were probably expecting this one. All those scenes in the book, Elena, Vivaldi, especially Elena. Both. At one point, I think it's the three of them, Elena, Vivaldi, and Paulo, enjoy the landscape. And landscape doesn't begin to do justice to what they find out there in the natural world, as I think even this scene indicates. Sublimity, another word that she uses to cover the same phenomenon in nature. Grandeur, as we see in this scene, which I will not reread at this point, except to suggest, starting with the sentence, a spot, and making your way through down to the word grandeur and even further. I think you get a very good sense of this first point I would like to make about grandeur or the sublime, which are synonyms for her, not for everyone. Is that the objects in that landscape clearly need to be of a certain kind, and they need to be, in one word, stupendous. And I give you a little bit of a description here that is based upon the details of the passage of exactly what that word stupendous means. Those objects that are stupendous enough, large enough in size, dynamic enough in character or nature, and let's say in nature, and one of a certain character, earn this term grandeur, okay, or this term sublimity. The word grandeur shows up on a number of occasions. What's nice about this particular passage, which is also in chapter 6, is that we see the equivalence between grandeur and sublimity suggested to us, in fact, more or less denoted by the function of the sentence. The syntax puts the two terms into synonymous relations, so we're not inferring that so much as just reading it right out of the book. I will read the sentence, or part of the paragraph indeed. Elena, after having been so long shut in darkness, you see that at the bottom of the page, and brooding over her own alarming circumstances, found temporary though feeble relief in once more looking upon the face of nature, till her spirits being gradually revived and elevated by there's the word, the grandeur of the images around herself. She said to herself, before we get to what she says to herself, just note, if you will, that the feebleness, that temporary feebleness, well, the temporary relief that she finds, which is here characterized as feeble, the feebleness itself is temporary, okay? Until, okay? It's only feeble for a few seconds or only for a short duration, and only until her spirits gradually reviving and elevating and having that happen to them by way of the grandeur of the images around her, being revived and elevated by the agency of that grandeur. These feelings, this relief is no longer feeble, it's something else. And that's in fact where we're headed in this discussion. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay. Her spirits revived and elevated by the grandeur of the scene. She says something to herself. So what is it that she says to herself? If I am condemned to misery, you remember where we are in the plot, surely I could endure it with more fortitude in scenes like these. Well, these are the scenes that, upon which she happens as she's being abducted, okay? And the carriage that is functioning as the vehicle of her abduction pulls over on a couple of occasions, you will recall. And here's one of them. Surely I can endure it with more fortitude in scenes like these than amidst the tamer landscapes of nature. Here the objects seem to impart somewhat of their own force, their own sublimity to the soul. It is scarcely possible to yield to the pressure of misfortune while we walk as with the deity amidst his most stupendous works. And you see sublimity here, as I said on the previous screen or slide, pulled into parallel with grandeur. Okay, these objects which display grandeur, I mean, we might as well have had that word, right? That seem to impart somewhat of their own force, their own grandeur to the soul. I like the word sublimity because it becomes a term, and I think it's good that it's here for us, and it's good that it's used in this fashion. I say good for us, Because what it does is, in fact, point us at this huge issue in 18th century philosophy, and it becomes a great, huge issue in 18th century and even into 19th century English literature. Okay, this whole question of the sublime and its value and its interest, the sublime in nature, which is not going away, you know, with respect to the topics that we'll be encountering this semester. You will see this in our very next book. Okay, Frankenstein also has a lot of scenes of sublimity. And here finally are a couple of slides, one passage really, just 2 slides devoted to it, that I will read that I think, I don't even know that they clarify, they just instantiate this same dynamic. Okay, give us just another example of this dynamic, or another kind of articulation of it. Okay, another instance of it that we see in the book. And I think it's a bit amplified. Okay, I think it's just in case we missed it the first time, Radcliffe makes it even clearer in this passage than she did before, how this works, that this dynamic that we've been looking at. I'm going to read the passage. To Elena, whose mind was capable of being elevated, highly elevated, or sweetly soothed by scenes of nature. We know that, do we not? The discovery of this little turret was an important circumstance, and this is a kind of narrative reflection. The narrator's reflecting on the scene we just talked about, where she walks up and finds a little room in the turret. Hither she could come, and her soul, refreshed by the views it afforded, would acquire strength to bear her with equanimity through the persecutions that might await her. You could have predicted that sentence, correct? Here, gazing upon the stupendous imagery, see the consistency, by the way, speaking of imagery, and just diction, look at the consistency in diction on the part of Radcliffe, who really does want us to remember those other passages. So she repeats a lot of the same language, and I think has a very consistent and clear and concise mind, and doesn't see the need to introduce new terms that might just confuse, right? Here, gazing upon the stupendous imagery around her, looking, as it were, beyond the awful veil which obscures the features of the deity and conceals him from the eyes of his creatures, dwelling as with a present God in the midst of his sublime works. With a mind thus elevated, how insignificant. With a mind thus elevated, how insignificant. Let's move on. Yes, so Elena is saying something to herself. I believe Radcliffe is thereby saying something to us. And here's the equation, I think, that is indicated by that saying. Grandeur or sublimity. We've already made the equation between the two of them. Produce this emotion of awe. Okay? I think that's going to be very consistent over the course of these different passages of the sublime that we run into in the book. And we're not going to look at all of them, obviously. Wouldn't have time. But we're going to look at a couple here. We've already begun to look at them. Grandeur, just noting in passing, in part as recap, let us mention, grandeur is again spoken of in this passage that we just read, as was in the first passage that we read, is again spoken of as an objective quality, a quality of the landscape, something in evidence when you have objects stupendous enough. And note again in the passage that we just read, and you can go back to it on your own time if you would like, or maybe you have it there open before you as we proceed. Note again the attention to the objects, as we just heard them called, the stupendous objects, as we heard them called in the previous passage, and the images, as we hear them called here, that do the elevating. There's a lot of attention to the details of the objects, the qualities of the object, stupendous qualities of the object in these passages of sublimity. Note too how Anne Radcliffe's narrator substitutes the term sublimity. This is kind of, again, by way of recap, as if it were exactly synonymous with grandeur. Just wanted to mention in passing that this is not going to be the case for lots of other people. Not all of, we're not going to be able to tour this discourse of the sublime as it makes its way through late 18th and early 19th century literature. We simply, don't have time to do that because we've got other fish to fry, right? But it's worth mentioning in passing that Immanuel Kant, for example, as opposed to the great theorist of the English theorist of the sublime, or philosopher of the sublime, okay, who was not the German Kant, but was an Englishman whose name is Burke, Edmund Burke. But for Kant, sublimity was more an aspect of the soul, an experience of the soul, as opposed to the object. Okay. Now we sort of verge on that in this, in that previous passage. Note how grandeur sublimity revives and elevates the spirits. There's nothing feeble about it once it fully expresses itself. So you see, it has this immediate effect upon the spirits, or the soul, that you can imagine that it's so immediate that it's very difficult to prize these apart. Okay, so you think of it this way: if you can imagine someone walking around in a certain frame of mind, in which he or she was ready to have sublime experiences and is kind of looking around for a trigger, you get a little bit of the idea that Kant wants you to have about the sublime, as opposed to Burke, in which case it's a response on your part to a certain objective stimulus. Okay, and there's finally something very important about that distinction, but let's not worry about it right now. Proceeding with our recap, or really we're maybe moving into some new territory here as I read. Indeed, the ultimate measure of its power, the power of sublimity, is to be seen in its effects upon the soul, the spirits which appear to respond to it, answer to it, resonate with it. If the objects be sublime enough or grand enough, we resonate with awe. An emotional peak, all of this is in that passage if you look closely, an emotional peak rising above the luxurious and solemn melancholy we found in the first passage, or the positive pleasure dreadful. That's a phrase that shows up a couple of times as a way of characterizing the kind of pleasure that Elena takes in the landscape, a dreadful pleasure. Well, this melancholy and this pleasure, like these emotions that she feels in the presence of these stupendous objects, okay, are themselves beneficent. There's something about them that are very helpful to her. They provide relief, for example, as we said before, but nothing quite like that awe. That's something that even seems to top the melancholy and the pleasure, and it's to be ranged with them because it's also an emotion that is triggered by these sublime and stupendous objects. Okay, but almost seems to be a new and this highest pitch of emotional resonance that you can enjoy when you're in those landscapes, as I'm calling it here, this ultimate species of awe, right? This ultimate species of emotion, I suppose, which is called awe. It is a sublimated, this ultimate species of emotion that we may know of as awe, and is distinguished as such several times in these passages of the sublime. This ultimate species of emotion is a sublimity of emotion, equivalent somehow to the grandeur sublimity of the objects, which, as you recall reading, impart somewhat of their own force. Now, this may not seem all that important, but this is something that Radcliffe feels the need to point out to us, that your emotional response to the objects is almost as stupendous. In fact, I'm going to argue, finally, more stupendous than the objects themselves and their impact upon your sensation, and your sensory apparatus. Let's move on. And you see, I pretty much made this point just now. A species of awe, sublimity of emotion, equivalent somehow to, is it not greater than? That awe triggered by the experience of mountains moves mountains, maybe even heaven and earth. And what do we mean by that? That you walk out into the mountains, you have an experience. It's a sensational experience of the stupendousness of the objects out there. We could go through all the details that we have on that first slide of force and size, and they have to have a certain kind of character as well. So you're out in the mountains, you have this experience, and you almost, in a sense, you can turn away from the mountains at that moment and kind of enjoy the experience independent of them, as it were, for a moment. Okay? Because the experience almost becomes kind of autonomous. Now, Kant would love that. He likes that notion, but I think even Burke would agree that there's something really huge about what happens in us when we look at these mountains. And it's one of the reasons why we like to go and look at mountains. They don't really make us feel small, if you can see what I mean. They don't really make us feel small. And you might think that they would make us feel small. But no, they make us feel big. okay? And you get the sense that they kind of render petty all the little concerns that we have that are kind of temporal, social, and have to do with the human scene as we participate in the grandeur and sublimity of these objects out in the world. And that's one of the reasons why I think Elena finds something beyond relief, even a positive kind of condition of awe, as we were saying, a condition of exaltation, even transcendence, right? When she's out there having these experiences. And let us quote that line. Elena, while she was crossing, it's when she's crossing the bridge amidst gloom and vastness, amazing force and uproar, almost forgot her misfortunes. That's towards the bottom of the page, right? I'll go ahead and read just a little portion of the page. We have the dreadful pleasure showing up again. Elena ascended it, right? This road, not with indifference, but with calmness. She experienced somewhat of a dreadful pleasure in looking down upon the irresistible flood. Notice how she's not really afraid. It's an aesthetic experience she's having. This is something that we've been saying since day one. It's almost an experience, as it were, of art horror for her, as opposed to fight or flight, flight literally. You wish you had the wings of a bird to survive if you fall off that bridge, right, or fall off this road. She doesn't really have that fear, okay? There's a certain calmness, you see that, and she can actually take pleasure in the scene, and that's why you can't really have an experience of the sublime if you're, falling out of an airplane without a parachute, right? Now, if you have the parachute, I guess you could have it, right? But not without a parachute, because you can't really be afraid for your skin, because that makes it something other than an aesthetic experience that's enjoyed with a certain calmness and pleasure. In any event, this emotion was heightened into awe. Here we have it, right? Where we see this distinction between these emotions that are provoked by the stupendous landscape, by the sublimity, by the grandeur. This emotion was heightened into awe. This is where you want to end up when you're having one of these sublime experiences, okay? Because then you get the payoff, which is this kind of sense of transcendence. This emotion was heightened into awe when she perceived that the road led to a slight bridge. Here's that bridge, which, thrown across the chasm of an immense height, united two opposite cliffs between which the whole cataract of the river descended. The bridge which was defended, guarded only by a slender railing, appeared as if hung amidst the clouds. A sublime scene indeed. Elena, while she was crossing it, almost forgot her misfortunes. You see what I'm saying? She's not afraid of falling off the bridge when she's crossing the bridge. She's having an aesthetic experience as she walks across it. She feels safe and calm. Okay, dreadful pleasure, let alone that melancholy, that solemn melancholy we talked about before, heightening into awe, right? You see what happens. She almost, I think in other moments, as we will see shortly, she does forget her misfortunes, forgets about the whole human scene, right? And this is one of the great things about the sublime, is that it reminds us that we are not, gives us a sense of our own freedom as souls and spirits, okay, that we're not bound by the temporal, the worldly, the fleshly, the corporeal, right? And as I try to formulate it for you in this little bullseye moment, sublime nature creates an awe that frees her from ordinary human concerns. And here we see it again. Right, this, as the grandeur awakens. Let's start at the top of the paragraph, and then we'll go back to my little annotation over there on the right. She ascended the winding steps hastily and found they led only to a door. This is a later scene, right? This is later on in chapter 8, and still obviously in volume 1, but chapter 8, a couple of chapters down the road from the scene before. And this is after she's been imprisoned in the convent, right? And she finds that little room upstairs. This is that scene. She ascended the winding steps hastily and found they led only to a door opening into a small room where nothing remarkable appeared, till she approached the windows and beheld thence an horizon and a landscape spread below. And here's that language that is so familiar to us at this point, whose grandeur awakened all her heart. Okay? And I think I almost want to say that awe is beyond the heart, and it's something more spiritual. It's like your soul is awakened in those moments. But let's press on. The consciousness of her prison was lost. And there it is. There's that payoff. We get it immediately. while her eyes, we get notice of it immediately, while her eyes ranged over the wide and freely sublime scene without. And then we get some of the details, these precipices, right? And as I say over the way, as the grandeur awakens all her heart, her eyes ranging over the wide and freely sublime scene, right? The consciousness of her prison was lost. She has that moment of transcendence. That is what is so valuable in so many ways about these experiences of the sublime is conceived by lots of people at that time, Kant and Burke both, okay? Though for Kant, it was a different form of transcendence, as I think we've maybe already seen. Human concerns, right, include this freedom from human concerns that she enjoys in such moments. I think it's made very clear to us that these include a wide range of human concerns. That's one of the nice things about this passage, right? One of its achievements, one of its contributions. The consciousness of her prison was lost. So human concerns include worry, fear of anything a human can do to you, pretty much, right? Any persecutions they might visit upon you, to your body at least, I suppose. Since this is, for Kant especially, a matter of the soul's freeing itself up and feeling its own freedom from temporal concerns, you can imagine that someone who managed to get at your soul, okay, well, I'm not sure that the sublime would be a remedy or a relief, okay, from such experiences, but it covers lots of other experiences, that's for sure, right? Though, what's interesting about this is, again, there's probably some distance and daylight between Kant and Burke on this question, but you gotta think that, especially for Burke, if you don't have your senses awake so that you can receive the stupendousness of the sublime objects and all their stupendousness, you probably don't have these emotions of the sublime triggered within you, right? And this is actually something that is talked a lot about by romantic poets, and they have a whole myth of memory, okay? They have this whole romantic faculty that they call memory, and it's pretty much the same faculty that we know of as memory, but it has this ability for a poet like Wordsworth, a poet like Coleridge. It has this ability to preserve your access, as it were, to those stupendous objects and all their stupendousness. Even 5 years later, when you're in a city, walking up and down city streets, and you're not having sublime experiences, you still have a certain access to that emotion, because by way of this faculty of memory. And I know my graduate students who are in the romantics course know exactly what I'm talking about in this moment, but let's move on. With a mind thus elevated, how insignificant would appear to her the transactions and the sufferings of this world. We know this. We're all over this now, right? How poor the boasted power of man, when the fall of a single cliff in these mountains would with ease destroy thousands of his race assembled on the plains below. How would it avail them that they were accoutered for battle, armed with all the instruments of destruction, and also persecution, right? That human invention ever fashioned. Thus man, the giant who now held her in captivity, would shrink to the diminutiveness of a fairy or a pygmy, and she would experience that his utmost force was unable to enchain her soul or compel her to fear him while he was destitute of virtue. So you can, as I put it over there on the right, you can do the math here, can't you? The mountains are bigger than men. These little diminutive fairies or pygmies are so little and kind of insubstantial, even when they're armed, and even when they have chains and they have these institutional structures or strictures that they're going to impose upon you. The mountains are so much bigger than they are that to the extent that you're in touch with the mountains, they don't seem very big at all, do they? And to the extent that your soul puts you in touch with the mountains, or the mountains put you in touch with your soul, right? Your soul, we've seen this already, is as big as the mountains, if it's not bigger than the mountains. And therefore, you are bigger than those men, right? Because you're as big as the mountains, and the mountains are bigger than the men. So you can just kind of do the math, and you can see how petty all these human concerns are, provided that you have access to the sublime. Okay. By the way, just noting in passing, the business about, really more on the previous slide than this slide, the business about God and and the veil of the divine and the rest, indicates, does it not, that, and again, this will be of more interest, I think, to students from the Romantics course from last semester. It will still be of interest to others, will it not, that Radcliffe is in many ways a very conventional sensibility, despite these moments in which she's being kind of hip, okay, and doing something very contemporary when she's in these scenes of sublimity and whatnot. Nevertheless, we have God there, don't we? God's not left out of the picture. And so this whole dynamic is kind of ordained by God. You can almost imagine that, according to Radcliffe, God gave us mountains. God also gave us souls gave us souls. Well, all that is cleared up, right? But God also gave us that power, right, that goes by the name of sublimity, whereby when we come into contact with the mountains, we can trigger this awe, right, that frees us from these persecutions and lowly human temporal worries and concerns. And that's another, I suppose you could say, kind of providence, I think, according to Radcliffe. Radcliffe would see that as well as a providence offered by Providence with a big P. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about all this today, I hope, in a little while. So in our Collaborate session. So see you soon.